Alrighty, folks, welcome into the inaugural edition of Calling It How I See It. I'm Blake Tarrants. You might have seen me out and about in Kansas City, formerly of Sports Radio 810 WHB. I'm on Twitter at BT Sportsman if you've ever seen me and my many sports takes. And I got my good buddies Kyle Sullivan and Quentin James here. You know, we're all originally Kansas City natives from the Missouri side. Those boys have since migrated to the sinful side of the Kansas-Missouri border. So they're going to have a lot to add as residents of Kansas when we get to the Royals-Chiefs Stadium talk today and in the future. But real excited to have you guys on. Thanks for bearing with me through all the tech stuff. Is this your guys' first attempt? I have a SoundCloud one that anybody may or may not have seen at some point. Is this your guys' first attempt at making/creating your own podcast?
It certainly is for me. I've been told I have the face for it, Got
Yeah.
three white guys and some bad sports takes. I think we got a good formula for a podcast here.
Oh, yeah.
It didn't quite have the faces for TV, so here we are.
Not the face for the TV, but a face for a computer cam,
Yeah.
a webcam, apparently. Yeah.
Exactly.
Standard
Yeah, no, I think I've appeared on podcasts before, like other people's. I think maybe the first iteration of yours, Blake, I was on.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I think so.
And then another friend's, but no, not to this extent. Never on camera for a podcast before. This is first.
Nice. All right. So, to give you a little summary, this podcast will be evolving over time. We'll talk a lot of Kansas City sports, a lot of Royals, Chiefs. I'm sure we'll delve into the local colleges at times, especially, we're recording this on the last day of February. So, as March Madness gets going, looks like all of our local teams, at least Mizzou and KU, that is, will be in the tournament. K-State, probably not so much, but we'll get into those local teams. And then we've got we're all pretty educated on the Chiefs, pretty well on the Royals. Kyle probably is going to have more to offer on like the Kansas side of the college sports. He grew up a KU fan, knows a lot about Wichita State, went there, now works at a community college in Kansas. So, he'll have a lot to offer for the college sports. Quentin and I are probably the two biggest baseball nerds of the group. And then, if we ever talk soccer, Quentin will dominate that conversation. He might be the only one. I don't know much of anything about soccer. I don't know about you, Kyle, but so that's kind of our general expertise. And we'll probably do some, messing around, just talking about goofy stuff. We'll talk about Kansas City stuff. It'll go a lot of different directions. So I appreciate you all bearing with us. We're going to start this first episode, seems fitting, talking about the Chiefs as they, wrapped up their attempt, ultimately a failed attempt at a three-peat. Just a few weeks ago, we were all together at my place, along with a couple other friends, to watch that disappointment. Guys, are we all in agreement that, even if they remain the same level of contenders, that this is kind of on the level of the last time they lost a Super Bowl to Tampa Bay back in the 20-21 season? We expect it's probably going to be the most significant changes to the roster as we've seen from any year to year since then, right?
I think it's got to be with the upcoming free agent class. I think as we record this here on the 28th of February, obviously the big news, the first big domino kind of fell with the Trey Smith franchise tag, and we'll learn more if they're able to extend them from there. But it's that kind of tough mix here of almost unprecedented territory where the Chiefs have consistently been right at that Super Bowl, right on the cusp of winning it, if not winning it. So they're always trying to decide, are we rebuilding, or are we still kind of in win mode now? So kind of the tough area that Veach seems to always find himself in. Good spot to be in for sure.
Q, what about you? Are you expecting about as much roster turnover as we've seen since the offensive line overhaul and such after 2020?
Yeah, I think that's safe to say that the Super Bowl is a little bit of a wake-up call. I mean, obviously we got through the season with a pretty incredible 15-2 record, but all along the way, we kept saying, are they really this good? They kept winning 1, 2, 3-point games, pulling it out with some of the craziest ends of games I've ever seen. So and when it was happening, it kind of felt like it was a team of destiny. Like we're just this good. Like
Right.
we have the coach, the quarterback. That's all you need. But ultimately, it's a 53-man roster, and our 53 was not as good as Philly's. So we have some
Yeah, I
work
think
to do.
that was pretty well established. That I mean, that was the first time. Like you said, you're winning all those 1, 2, 3 point games. Hard. I don't think. How, that'd be an interesting stat to know. I was doing all the prep work to try to get this podcast off the ground. I didn't research a bunch of nerdy stats, but I have I'm not sure they won very many games by more than one possession at all this year. Like I bet you could count on one hand how many games they won by 2 scores, meaning like 9 or more points. So,
I think their point differential was that of like a 10 or 11 win team.
Yeah, a 500 team, slightly above 500 team. And, like you said, there's two ways you can see that. Like throughout the season, the emotional fan side of you says, team of destiny because you keep winning that. But then the logic side of you says, well, that's a team playing out over its skis. And so, like you said, the head coach, quarterback, because of how outsized the importance is of positions like that, you can overcome a lot of things. But, and obviously they have still a well above top half, probably still top quarter of the league overall 53-man roster. But what happens when you run into it? Because, I mean, we knew going into the Super Bowl that Philadelphia's, especially at the front, that their roster was significantly better than the Chiefs. They had much better offensive and defensive lines. Now, again, like, I still can't say I expected what we saw, though, because I said the same thing. I don't even know so much about Buffalo. Like I'd say their offensive line is certainly better than the Chiefs' offensive line, but as far as the units facing each other, it didn't seem so bad. But, Houston was the game I was worried about, with Will Anderson and Danielle Hunter coming off the edges. I had thought that what might happen in the Philly game in the Super Bowl might happen in that game. And instead, the Chiefs, if you remember, kind of flipped it around on them. George Karlaftis just had a day, sacked Stroud, 3 times? And so I thought, after that game, I was like, well, they've figured out how to overcome that stuff. But then, so that's what I kind of want to dive into real quick on the Super Bowl before we move into a little bit of the draft and what's happening with their pending free agents and stuff. I think the most underappreciated part of the Super Bowl, I mean, everybody who watched the game knew Mahomes just had an off day. He was making rush decisions. He clearly was not handling the pressure very well. I mean, everybody knows that was one of the worst games Mahomes has played. I mean, he himself has acknowledged that. I think one of the biggest reasons beyond the talent disparity of what happened in the Super Bowl is, and why maybe it didn't happen in the Houston game when we thought the similar thing could happen, is I don't think they played the same game in the Super Bowl. You know what I mean? Like I felt like there was a lot of a term I've heard thrown around a lot, which seems appropriate, is hubris from the coaching staff. If you noticed in the Houston and Buffalo game, and even the last few games of the regular season, as Joe Tooney shifted out to left tackle, they really evolved and adapted their offense to account for the fact that they had a left guard kicking out to tackle and basically a second-year undrafted player, I think, in Caliendo at left guard. And then in the Super Bowl, it was like, because they had won a couple games with that offensive line, it felt almost like the coaching staff was just like, oh, okay, so, we don't have to do any of that stuff anymore. We can go back to drop back passing, slinging it all over the field like we've got Eric Fisher and Mitch Schwartz at tackle now. Like it's almost like they forgot why they had been able to make it work and just thought they could just treat it like a normal offensive line. And now they'll handle the Phillies' massive front, and it had predictable results. I mean, do you guys feel like the coaching staff might have actually been as much of a problem as any of the players? Because, I mean, execution was a problem. Nobody's denying that. But it felt like they didn't call the same plays we had seen them had success with.
Yeah, I don't know about you, Quentin. I definitely haven't gone back and subjected myself to rewatching that tape again. But I had the same thoughts. Yeah, it didn't seem like that the Eagles came out and did anything beyond what they put on tape before, and the coaches
Vic
went out.
Fangio said that. Yeah.
Yeah, the coaches went out there and said as much, and then I didn't really feel it was until the second half until they did much to try to kind of get Mahomes rolling out to start the half. And like you said, it was one of those things where the tackles were the biggest problem again in the Super Bowl, but they weren't the only problem. So there are lots to look in the mirror. Obviously, the tackles didn't give you a chance to win the game, but this one was a little bit more demoralizing than the Tampa game because it didn't feel like the offense in general had done everything they could to potentially get it done for you, even in this scenario if the tackles had held up. So a little bit of a wake-up call and something to think about heading into next year.
Yeah, I do think the lack of adjustments from the coaching staff was probably the most discouraging thing. I mean, especially after halftime, not even trying to bring in, backups, tackles like the one we signed midseason. I forget his name. Humphreys, right? I mean, I know Tooney had done well throughout the playoff run, but it was pretty clear. Like, I mean, the whole line was just getting dominated by Philly's front four, and they really only rushed for the whole game.
Exactly. That's what I was saying. The next gen stats. I've read up on some of the film studies on the next gen stats. They did not blitz once, so it had nothing to do with, fancy pressures packages and simulated this and that. It was
right.
Our 4 against your 5. I think we can kick your ass, and they did.
And it's no wonder that no one was getting open with dropping 7 back coverage. So, yeah, I think we probably could have run the ball more.
Not like that was super effective when they did either, though. They rushed for about 2 yards a carry, if I remember right. So they just didn't have an answer.
Hole as soon as they did very early in the game, it is hard to go back to the run for sure. So,
yeah,
I mean, I think another factor to consider is, the Chiefs had gotten so comfortable coming back down double digits in games, it almost felt like there was a lack of urgency to
like
start
this is
it
just
off.
what we do. We fall behind and we're fine.
Right. Yeah.
Well, and there was even some of that. I'm trying to remember the exact scenario. There was even some of that when, I remember what it was. So they'd fallen behind. I believe it was 10-0 at the time. And Hurts threw that helium ball interception down near the goal line to Brian Cook. And we were like, oh, okay, this is where the Chiefs start doing their thing. We all had that same reaction. It's like, oh, okay, here we go. This is, we fall behind 10-0. It looks bad for a second.
The game starts.
Yeah. And then, they drove a little bit. And then I believe that next possession after Hurts threw that pick down near because I think the Chiefs got the ball at like the 2-yard line, right? And then they drove out to about the 20. And then Mahomes on like a 3rd and long tried to throw a hero ball. And that's resulted in about that 40-yard pick 6. And it wasn't too long after that the Eagles pinned him deep, and Mahomes threw an interception in the red zone. So I mean, that was game right there. I mean, I agree with you though. Like there is a sense of like they're used to coming back, which I mean, it is what Mahomes has built his career off of, like having the over Tom Brady's career record, and like I can't remember off the top of my head what stat I saw, if it was combining all regular playoffs games or whatever, but like the best quarterback behind Mahomes has like a winning percentage in the high 300s in his career when he's behind double digits in a game, and Mahomes is still above 500 in games where he trails double. So I can understand why you get into the mindset of like, we don't panic, we don't, and I also get that Andy Reid is kind of an old school coach in that way. Like the only time I recall him ever like making a significant personnel change in game that was not injury related was like a running back that fumbled the ball. Like Carson Steele got himself put on the shelf pretty quick this year because of that. LaShawn McCoy did that a few years back. That's like the only time I've ever seen him make in-game significant changes that weren't related to injury. So like, I mean, you and I had that debate at halftime, Curie, like Humphreys has got to be a tackle when they come back out, right? And I was like, well, that might be the right decision, but it ain't going to happen. And you were like, oh, come on, like this is the Super Bowl. And I'm just like, well, that's not Andy Reid's way. And I don't know, like, I don't know if that really would have made anything better. Humphreys played a little bit. I think, in one game when they first signed him, hurt his hamstring, then missed a couple games. And then he did play, though, if you remember, in that last regular season game against the Broncos, and most of the other guys didn't play. And, I mean, again, to be fair, he didn't have – the rest of the offensive line was backups. But, Nick Bonito, the Broncos' talented edge rusher, I mean, he whipped Humphrey several times in that games and hit Carson Wentz a lot. So I'm not sure it would have made a big difference. But, yeah, I mean, I do agree with you. They fell into that rut of, like, this is what we do. We start slow. We fall behind. It's almost like an element of hubris, like I said. So, I mean, I think we all understand what led up to and why that happened. So if we're moving on to what we think is going to happen in the next month or two leading up to the draft, I believe that was yesterday. Yeah, on Twitter, we learned Trey Smith will be getting the franchise tag. Now, I don't think anybody expected that until a couple of days ago, because Brett Veach himself said that the biggest reason they ended up doing that, like he essentially admitted they didn't plan on doing that initially. In fact, I think I remember seeing a report that the Chiefs didn't plan on using the franchise tag like a week ago. And then the salary cap came in almost $10 million higher than any of the projections had. I don't know if you guys saw that, but like the original projections were between like 265 and 270 million, and it came in at 279.2 is what the official figure was earlier this week.
Money's, it's hitting, getting these guys paid a little extra.
I think it is that. So, I mean, I guess that is what opened the window to getting Smith on there. And I don't think any of us expect, like, I don't think they're going to, I'm sure they will do stuff like restructuring Mahomes' deal and maybe Chris Jones, although you got to be careful with that one because, I worry about how that deal's going to age as it is. So you restructure that, push more money into the future. But I'm sure they'll do things anyway just to give themselves cap room. But, like, I assume they're not going to be able to go into the start of the league year with Smith on a cap at a $23.5 million cap hit. They're either going to tag and trade him and have a trade in place that'll kick in the moment the league year starts so they don't have to clear the space for it, or they'll have an extension with a much lower first-year cap hit. I tweeted out yesterday, again, y'all can follow me at BT Sportsman on there, that I assume it was a tag and trade scenario. Well, and I updated it today because all the gossip this morning was they seem confident they're pretty close to a long-term deal. So, I mean, again, both of those solve the short-term issues, a trade, or obviously if they do get an extension done, the first-year cap hit's going to be much lower. So if we extrapolate out from that scenario, since that seems to be where this is headed, I mean, I'm assuming that means that Tooney and Jawan Taylor are both gone after this year, and both of their cap. Tooney's contract, I believe, is just up after this year, and then Taylor, I think, is a pretty easy cut. So, assuming that is what happens, how do you guys feel about that? I mean, would you rather trade Smith for what you can get and then try to extend Tooney instead, or something like that? Or, I mean, are you okay if that's the plan? Get Smith on a long-term deal, and then Tooney and Taylor are both gone after this year? I don't know. None of this answers the left tackle question, which we all agree is the biggest one. So which route do you guys prefer, I guess? We kind of know where it's headed, I think, but it could change. So which route do you guys prefer out of those two I just outlined?
I don't know if it's what I prefer, but it kind of feels to me a little bit like the Tooney extension might be coming down the pike a little bit. The problem with the right tackle and left tackle situation, I don't think is too dissimilar from what you see at quarterback, or I think a lot of the league right now has a right tackle and a left tackle problem. There just aren't 32 good offensive tackles, and it's not for a lack
let alone
of
64.
Yep. So it's not just for a lack of the Chiefs trying. They tried to pay Trent Williams a few years ago in that rare case where it came available. They've thrown draft picks at it. They kind of, how you talk about all the time, quarterbacks getting overpaid for being mediocre. I feel like that's kind of what we've gotten out of Jawan Taylor. It's, we paid him. But It's like, hey, well, he's probably better than what your next best option is. So you just kind of live with it. And so
he's better than Andrew Wiley. And that's basically, right. That was our bar. So
still ever since the Swartz and Fisher years, still trying to play catch up there. So I don't know. Like you said, some combo of maybe a Mahomes extension and reworking. Maybe you extend Tooney to kind of spread that out a little bit. But it's a tough situation to be in for sure. And wouldn't be shocked if they went back to tackle in the first round again, because it's one of those things, even if you don't love the class, it's kind of what are your options? Same thing with teams having to try over and over again at quarterback. Just one of those high value positions where the supply and demand are a little out of order there.
Q, what you got?
I mean, it was surprising to me just because, like you guys are saying, tackle seems to be the much bigger priority right now. And it's been nice these past couple of years to have arguably the best interior offensive line in the league with Smith, Humphreys, and Tooney. But
Yep.
it's at a certain point you gotta. I mean, Mahomes needs tackles. We saw that all season long. He's not getting the time that he needs for these guys to get open. Now, some of that could be solved by getting better pass catchers. I mean, Rice was obviously able to find a lot of success. Kelce in his prime, they were able to overcome some of the tackle problems, but yeah, $23 million for a guard is a lot of money, and I don't know what's more likely at this point. I think trading him is going to be difficult, just because, like I just said, that's a lot of money for a guard. So maybe they go for an extension now, but I think the bigger question is what do we do at left tackle?
Yeah, and that is I don't know that the Smith question is gonna truly affect what you do at left tackle because in my mind, they're kind of almost separate. You handle them in separate ways, right? So even if they never put the tag on Smith at all and they just let him walk in free agency, I was listening to today's the Friday episode that a guy I used to work with, Soren Petro at 810, guy met at Mizzou, and at 810, Sam McDowell and Jeff Chadia all do the Red Gold and Bold podcast Tuesdays and Fridays. And I actually was listening to their episode this morning, and they made a really interesting point too, that, I think one of the biggest reasons beyond the salary cap implications that we were so surprised that Smith got the franchise tag is you would think at least one of the failed experiments at left tackle could hopefully step in and play right guard. Like if Kingsley Suamataia is not a tackle, then you would hope he's at least a starting caliber guard. He certainly would have the tools. Same with Morris. In fact, I think we saw Wanya Morris play some guard in like preseason games and in that Bronco game. But they made the interesting point too that it's like, it's not a good thing. It's an indictment of their drafting. But if the Chiefs thought that either of those guys could step in and play right guard next year, would they have put the tag on Trey Smith? Like, I'm not sure that they feel confident in that plan. And so that to me is the biggest scary thing that goes into the left tackle situation. I personally don't think you're going to get, especially in this class. Last year was different. Last year, the Chiefs reportedly, I've seen a couple different places, had, every team has a different system of how they evaluate prospects, right? And so, but generally how they do it is they have, they go position by position. And then, like, obviously you're not going to see a kicker or probably even a running back, very many teams at this point that get true first round grades, but they don't necessarily even grade on that positional value thing. They go position by position and they go off pure talent and what they value. And then they essentially give guys grades, and there's probably more detail to it, but essentially they give them X round grades. These are first round talent, a second round talent, so on, so on. And last year, supposedly the Chiefs had 7 offensive tackles with a first round grade. Now they were all gone by pick like 23. So they didn't really have a realistic chance to get up there. But this year, I don't think, the Chiefs aren't going to have admitted that. They're not going to talk about that before the draft. You're going to find that out after the fact. But if you look at a lot of the draft boards, most guys who evaluate the draft have 2, maybe 3 tackles with a first round. So I don't think you're going to get a starting caliber tackle at 31. You're going to have to probably trade up, which, especially if they don't trade Trey Smith, that was the one reason I thought maybe it could be a tag and trade as well, is to try to get a little more draft capital. But I'm a little worried about, do they have a tackle evaluating problem? Because not only have Sumatia and Morris like conclusively failed as tackles, I mean, the Smith moves tells me they don't just think they can just slide right over to guard either. So do they have they clearly hit on Creed Humphrey a few years ago. They hit on Smith in that same draft, but we thought they maybe had a receiver judging problem there for a minute because, Sky Moore didn't work out. But Rice last year and Worthy this year have both, I think, shown that they can draft receivers. I'm not as certain. And think about right tackle. They had to go out and solve that problem in free agency. I'm not certain. I feel very good about the Chiefs drafting tackles right now. That seems to be bigger than receiver as a flaw in their evaluation of prospects right now.
Yeah, I think it kind of goes back to that same point we were having, though, when you're always drafting 30th, 31st, 32nd. There's only so many good tackles out there and available. And you kind of get to the point, too, where you wonder, I mean, I guess you can take the Buffalo Bills from this, who seem to be willing to trade with the Chiefs, did that to get Mahomes, and then with Worthy and McDuffie. So, or was it? I don't believe it was Worthy. It was McDuffie.
But yeah, it's both of them. It was. Yep.
Yeah, but I do kind of assume, I would think, logic is you would have most of the AFC where they're always, if your thought is you got to get through the Chiefs, what do they know? You don't want to support the team that's the wall that you had trouble getting through to get to the Super Bowl. But yeah, it's fair to wonder. Like you said, it's, you don't expect to get an all-pro when you're drafting, but just to get a competent floor at tackle seems to have been a challenge, and it's led to the Chiefs having to overpay in these Orlando Brown type situations, Juan Taylor situations. It'd be nice if we could at least get ourselves out of these 1-year deal where your hand is kind of forced.
Donovan Smith.
Yeah.
I honestly
think of them all now.
to me, what raises the biggest red flag, and again, I don't know, maybe this isn't it. That was just an idea I had planted in my head earlier today. So maybe it's just recency bias. Maybe they really did have a dream. Maybe they were like just really hoping they could get Trey Smith under, probably had accepted they weren't going to be able to, and then the minute the opportunity arose, they just couldn't help themselves because they just want to keep that interior through together. Maybe that is all it is. But like, dude, you've drafted Suamatia was a second-round pick, and Morris was he was a late second, and then last year, 2 years ago now, I guess 23, Morris was a late third. The fact that I find that's what to me the big red flag is. It's one thing for them to fail at tackle. I'm not even sure that Kingsley shouldn't get a second chance, but I'm just really worried that they clearly, not only have they decided they're probably not the answer at tackle, but I feel like, I mean, we all have quite a bit of confidence in Brett Veach, and we definitely think he's a skilled tactician of the cap and a guy who's doesn't get over. He's not a guy who gets emotionally attached to. He's not going to make dumb contract decisions out of emotion or oh man, we can't get rid of this guy. So I think it does send a pretty strong message that not only have they decided they're not the answer at tackle, but they don't even feel confident about shifting them to guard. So if they're not either of those things, then they're going to be failed prospects. That's what really makes me wonder if they have a offensive line drafting issue. And don't forget, we haven't even mentioned him in this conversation because he was a day 3 pick, like a 5th rounder. But they also drafted Hunter Norzad, if you remember last year, and really chatted him up. And he was like the backup guard and center at all the spots this year. And now the
year before that.
Yeah, I mean, he didn't even survive. He didn't even survive a training camp. Yeah, I think he was a 5th rounder. That was back in 22, I believe. Also, but yeah, but I mean, yeah, throw him in there too. I mean, where is a drafted star? I mean, they haven't drafted an offensive lineman since Trey Smith that you can call a success story. That's just chronologically. Humphrey and Smith were in the same year. But I mean, they haven't drafted an offensive lineman since then that you could even say has worked in any way. That to me is the biggest red flag. And it's not, again, it's one thing if Kingsley Suamatia is not a left tackle. Maybe that was reaching a little too much. But he can't take over right guard after a year of experience. Yeah, I don't know. That's the bigger issue.
What's interesting with this too, with the franchise tag and Smith, and I think that will at the guard position, I think a tag and trade is difficult because you're having to extend and give up draft capital, which a lot of teams might not want to do. But what does make this really interesting, I'd be interested to hear from you guys as the Mizzou guys of the podcast here, is what does it mean for the defense? The strength of these last couple years teams, and really the defense had a pretty good performance in the Super Bowl. It just got put in some short fields repeatedly, but the first thing that comes to mind for me is, what does this mean for Nick Bolton? What does this mean for Justin Reed? How do those contracts look now? The thing that's been working, do you start to invest and try to go back to the fixing the offense more? Because I don't know that there's a lot of great options out there at tackle on the free agent market, but it does make me start to think, what do we have left to pay the guys on the defensive side of the ball? Nick Bolton, a little bit younger. We know that the team likes to kind of keep their long contracts to guys under 20, where I think Justin Reed is entering age 29, age 30 season this year. So that's what I'm kind of interested in, what this domino effect now looks like for the
Reed
overall.
Is actually pretty young as well. I think he was like 24 when he signed his I will be doing this for the audience's sake. So if you see me looking stuff up on my phone, because I'm recording on the laptop, so that's a good question. Let's see. How old is Justin Reed of the Kansas City Chiefs? Okay. Let's see.
Got him at 28 here. It looks like turned 28.
20. Okay, so he's and then Bolton, I believe, is just 24, because I think he got drafted at age 21. So yeah, You're right. Reed is a little older. Now they do. I do feel like linebacker, especially non-elite, like Bolton's not a Fred Warner, Dre Greenlaw level linebacker. Yeah, I don't even know if it'll be with the Chiefs. I don't think Bolton will get. I think Bolton's deal might actually be like closer to like the one the Chiefs gave Drew Tranquill last year, maybe a tad more, especially if he hits the open market. Like Tranquill's was like 3 years and like it was like $7 million per year, it's like $21 million. Bolton will probably get closer to 10 per. Like he might get like 3 and 30. I don't think he's gonna get the big huge deals like that Fred Warner got to stay in San Francisco or something like that, because he's not as complete a linebacker and he doesn't have the physical tools. So I'm not sure those guys would be as hard to re-sign as you might think hitting the open market. But I mean, yeah, you're right in general. I mean, because we could take this back to last year too. Even the defense, you guys remember, they didn't add a single player. Like there were no new faces other than rookies on the defense last year. They didn't sign a single defensive free agent. They just brought back a bunch of guys like Mike Pennell, Tranquill. They let Willie Gay walk. They brought back Tershawn Wharton. They gave Mike Dana a pretty decent contract.
Another interesting conversation point too. When you talking listing defensive tackles, I saw that Chris Jones currently the only defensive tackle under contract right now for 2025. Yep. So gotta have some money to be spent.
Well, Derek Nottie will be back. We all know that. But Derek Nottie will always.
MV Pennell will always come back in October, November. Get an injury or two.
He was here all year this past year. He was like October, November in 23, but I think he was on the team from the beginning this past year, wasn't he?
I think so. Anyway. I don't know if he had a couple inactive. Yeah, those guys always seem to linger around. Wharton might be a guy you lose in free agency. That contract might.
Yeah, I mean, he had 6.5 sacks this year, so I'm sure his.
You guys think they go after another edge rusher in free agency, or save it for the draft?
Yeah, so we'll obviously revisit that as free agency starts. I think we've made our rounds on this one. Let's move on to the Travis Kelce thing, because this one's a little weird. I mean, I think we're all like we all acknowledge he's not the same player he used to be, but he had a year left on his contract. I think I think he did consider retiring, but I think I was always assuming he would be back, if nothing else, after the Super Bowl loss the way it ended. He said as much, and he's got a year left on his contract technically, so it would be easier for him to retire after this year too. And if he wanted to do a Gronk, switcheroo in another year or two or something, he wouldn't be able to if he were still under contract. So I'm not necessarily surprised that he returns. But the cap number's weird. I mean, the cap number's too high. I mean, it's basically $20 million. And, all the rage on Twitter now is wanting to take all this out on Clark Hunt, because I didn't see an official report so much that like Veach or anybody like that has said, yeah, like we're not doing anything with his contract. He's playing on his current cap number. But maybe I missed something. Maybe somebody said something to the effect of like, there's not going to be an extension. They're not going to restructure and create void years since they're assuming this will be his last year in the league. Um, but whatever the situation is, I mean, that does seem like a big, like, then it's almost, we've almost switched to like, oh no, Kelce might be gone. Like, oh crap, Kelce's like back. He's not the same player. And boy, he's sure taking up a big chunk of the cap. And if they don't do anything, to liquidate some cash to essentially push some of that cap hit into the future, I mean, yeah, it creates dead money. It basically creates void years, especially because you expect him to retire. But, what do we make of that situation? Because I think we're all happy he's back, but whatever, again, I missed whatever the official report was that has everybody up in arms. Apparently they must have said they don't have any plans to change his contract around. But that's, been the conversation lately, is that, he's going to be playing on that cap figure. I mean, do you guys feel like, is he hurting the team at that point?
Yeah, highest paid tight end in 2025. Trey Smith, we got the highest paid guard in 2025. I think you're onto something there with the Clark Hunt blame, if that's where you want to put it. I know that's where the Eagles ownership group gets a lot of credit. They're willing to spread out on some dead cap. They're willing to pay guys a lot of money on the front end of contracts to avoid these kind of situations where Brett Veach doesn't always have that luxury. And that's kind of what we ran into with this Travis Kelce situation here, where he's got all this money he's owed in the twilight of his career and that last year of his contract. So, yeah, it's part of the value of Travis Kelce was he was always like a top 3 NFL wide receiver at, number 2 or 3 tight end money. So it'll be interesting. You got some cost control guys with Worthy and Rice. That definitely helps a lot, but leads to more questions here in the next week or two as we head into the draft.
Right, because that's my biggest question is Kelce on a $20 million cap hit? Like, I don't think any of us are crazy enough to say, that they should cut him or something. But, I don't know. Like, they could theoretically cut him on his current contract and try to bring him back on a new deal if they don't want to do an upfront cash bonus, because that essentially turns into the same thing but instead of spreading out dead money, they cut him and then re-sign him to a 1-year deal with most of the cash up front. Q, what do you think about this? I mean, is this a Clark Hunt issue, or do you flip this around and do you say, well, this is smart cap management because dead money maybe is one thing, but you really don't want dead money for a guy who's not even active anymore. Like, if you can anticipate that a guy's on the last year, maybe you take those lumps and you take that inflated cap number to avoid, even deader money, if that makes sense.
Well, you guys know I know about as much about the NFL cap as I do about rocket science. But would it be crazy to ask Kelce to maybe just take a little bit of a hometown discount, considering he's, involved with maybe the richest woman on earth, and
well, that's one angle I hadn't even thought about.
Got
that new Heights deal that's worth more than his NFL contract. Yeah, I don't know what portions of those are guaranteed or what those, but it is interesting because it sounds like all the reports, that have come out with this are that even before it was known that he was coming back, the reports were that if he were coming back, he was coming back on this deal. So I don't know if it's just kind of like a sign of respect. Hey, you're the greatest tight end in NFL history, franchise icon, face of the league now, even bigger so than Mahomes, like you said, with the Taylor Swift component, or if it's just a matter of ownership not wanting to take dead years on the cap. I don't.
Well, and see, from the ownership perspective, the dead money in future years wouldn't really be the issue, right? Because like that's not actually money you pay out. It's just like it essentially cuts off part of your cap resources. Like no cash goes out. Dead money doesn't actually mean any cash out. It essentially is just like wasted cap space. So the Clark Hunt side of things would be willing to write that upfront check to essentially pay him most of his salary in a lump sum. But I think that's the criticism of Clark Hunt. The dead money stuff, the not wanting to have dead money would honestly be coming more from the Chiefs front office because, again, that's not actually cash going out. It's just eating into their cap space in future years. The criticism of Clark Hunt would be not willing to cut him a check that essentially pays whatever 80% of his salary up front. Which
as opposed to what?
Well, so if they when you and I do forget sometimes, Q, my bad, that like you're not into the minutia of the cap.
Not
So
a cap
essentially,
scientist.
I
yeah. So
can't say I am. That's the cap savvy franchises do like to do all the guarantees on the front end, which obviously cost ownership more, and that gives GM more flexibility.
Well, and so how restructures work is essentially. Now, it's a little weird for Kelce's situation right now because he only has this 1 year left on his deal. So they would essentially be creating void years because I'm assuming there's no plan for an extension. But so like they do it for Patrick Mahomes most every year, who's got a, contract that goes into the next century, or like they even did it with like Jawan Taylor last year. So with guys that have multiple years left on a deal, how a restructure works is essentially like, I'm assuming you've seen the reports where they say the Chiefs have restructured Patrick Mahomes' deal, creating $10 million in cap space for this upcoming year that they wouldn't have had before. So now it's more complicated than that because like but essentially how it works is that means that they write him an immediate check up front, kind of, so they convert his salary into a signing bonus. What it means in everyday terms is they write him a big fat check for like 75, 80%, probably not that much in Mahomes' case because the salaries are so high, but anywhere from 30, 40 to 80% of his salary is paid up front in March or whenever they restructure it in a single check. And then they only receive the remaining portion of that salary that becomes their in-season base salary. So they change the base salary into a signing bonus to pay it up front, which means the base salary number gets dramatically lowered. That's what creates more cap space. And then it's essentially like a credit card concept of the salary cap, because what that then does is all that money that you wrote off in a signing bonus that was going to be base salary, that then gets pushed into it. Like, so let's say it's structured. Let's say they cut a $10 million check. Then that's going to, usually they do it over 5 years because that's the maximum length out you can prorate. So you would essentially be adding $2 million of dead money to your cap for each of the next 5 years in that scenario. That all makes sense? So that's the benefit of a restructure. But what that requires is for the owner to write a big fat check that covers a good chunk of that guy's salary up front, generally before the season. And that's the criticism of Clark Hunt, is that he doesn't seem willing to do that as opposed to just paying the base salary throughout the year.
So, I mean, for Kelce's example, I mean, he's only signed for 1 more year. So that's just paying him in March versus throughout the season.
You would, and in order to prorate it, like the credit would be paid in void years instead of adding it to future cap hits, because he has no future cap hit because he's only under contract for 1 more. You would essentially be creating void years, which are essentially fake years on the back of the deal that essentially he's not under contract, but it adds, again, like let's say it was 10 million and they spread it out over 5 years, or 4 would be 2.5. So if they were to write him a $10 million check this March, that he would be receiving $10 million. Whatever's left of his base salary would be paid throughout the year like normal. And then they would have, if they did it over 5 years, they'd have $2 million of dead Kelce money for the next 5 years after that on the cap each year. That's how a restructure generally works. And that's been the criticism of Clark Hunt, is that he's not willing to write those large checks. Now, again, I don't necessarily 100% agree with it because they do it every year to an extent. They did it with Joe Tooney a couple of years ago. They did it with Jawan Taylor last year. They do it with Patrick Mahomes almost every single year. So, they have shown a willingness to do it. But to Kyle's point, teams like the Eagles, I can't remember the exact stats, so don't try to quote me and don't kill me for this in the audience or whatever. But, the Eagles have, so like Jalen Hurts, Saquon Barkley, A.J. Brown, and a couple of their high-paid defenders. It was a 5-player example. It was Hurts, Barkley, A.J. Brown, and 2 high-paid defenders next year. Their combined cap hits are under $10 million because of how much they have written them cash checks up front. And then now eventually when you do it as extreme as the Eagles do, what that means is, like, I think it's in like the year 2029, maybe I saw in that conversation that they have like already from guys they've done that with, they have like almost $150 million of dead money in that year. So, I mean, there is a con of this approach, that it's like a credit card. Eventually the bill comes due, right? But like that's been the criticism of Clark Hunt while this window is so clearly open. So
the hope in the Eagles case there is that the cap always keeps going up too, obviously.
Right. As it dramatically went up this year, way more than expected. Yeah, exactly. So
little nerdy cap talk for everybody there, getting into the weeds.
So I guess what I was
liking those situations myself a little too.
I guess we'll move on to Royals after this, but I guess Q, what I'm trying to see is, like, you of all of us, as a general rule, we're not going to touch a third rail yet. We might do that in an eventual podcast, but we might get into our worldviews, and probably not the P word, hopefully too much. That's politics, not anything else weird. But, Q of all of us is probably the most, willing to say stuff like, God, I hate when billionaires are cheap. You know what I mean? So does this smack of that to you? Or, like, I think there's some validity to that criticism. Now that you understand how this process works, I'm curious what you think about that. Because I think there's some validity to that criticism, but I also think too that it's like, it's hard to put yourself in a billionaire's shoes, obviously, and I'd like to think I wouldn't be a cheap billionaire if I were, but I would have a bit of a conundrum if I'm Clark Hunt here with this Kelce situation, because dead money in general is one thing, and again, that's more the front office's hurdle to navigate. But why would I hamstring my front office and have a couple million shaved off my cap every year for the next 5 years for a guy who I know is likely retiring after this year? So I don't know. That's what does this smack up to you? Does this seem like smart? We're not backloading a retiring guy's contract, or does this seem like billionaire being cheap?
It does kind of seem like a philosophical approach type question. At least the way you're explaining it. Do we free up money this year for more free agents, or do we spread that money out over the next few years? I think in this case, it probably makes sense to spread it out, because it's not an outrageous number, and like Kyle said, the number does go up every year. Yeah, exactly. So, I mean, they have plenty of time. He just announced he's coming back, so I have faith that they're gonna come to some kind of solution here that's gonna work for them. I don't know that they're gonna have enough to make any big free agent splashes, but for right now, we can just be happy that we're getting Kelce back for one more year.
Yeah. And to be clear, the not having a ton of money to throw around for free agents, that's going to be a thing in perpetuity, and as long as Patrick Mahomes is the quarterback too.
Right.
That's the real culprit there. Right. I think we can all agree on that. So
always going to be looking at those guys trying to resurrect their career on 1-year deals, I think, for the short to medium term.
That's why you got to draft well.
Yeah.
Mm-hmm. All right. Let's move on to the Royals. Let's do optimism for an upcoming season instead. I love how, the first bullet point we have on our Google Doc here of what we were going to talk about with the Royals is any thoughts on spring yet. Clearly, I've been the one that's watched the most spring games, and that's not saying very much, because I don't think I've sat and watched one from start to finish yet. So maybe we don't necessarily, and I think it's a silly proposition anyway to try to overreact to spring games. I do want to kind of delve into
Sleep Champions t-shirt if they pull it off.
Hey, let's do it. Honestly, what I'm more interested in talking about than honestly though the results of the games is what to make of. So again, you guys may not have even watched enough to see this, but have you seen how much they're shuffling around the guys to different positions? Like, we knew when they traded for Jonathan India, like there was immediate talk about like, can he do some left field or whatever? But like, so today, for example, you want to know what the starting outfield for the Royals was today? It doesn't make any sense. The starting outfield for the Royals, as in, I'm not necessarily criticizing. It just doesn't make sense from what we've seen from these guys in the past and where they played. The starting outfield today was Michael Massey in left, Michael Garcia in center, and MJ Melendez in right. So like they are just plugging and they're just shifting guys all over the place. India started a couple games in left field to start the Cactus League. He's played a game or two at third base. Michael Massey's played some second and some left. He did actually make a couple nice plays in left. So what do we make of that? I mean, versatility is always good, but there's a fine line between, we've got a lot of guys who can play different positions, and I don't know where the hell we're going to put these guys.
I think we knew coming into spring that the outfield is going to be the biggest question mark. We really don't have a proven everyday player at any of those positions.
Hunter Renfroe is your best case. Is your most proven commodity in the outfield, and he was,
and also most expensive.
Yeah, he ended up. I do want to emphasize Renfroe. Like, a lot of people want to hate on Renfroe and say he was as like bad as MJ Melendez last year. He actually in the aggregate was about an average player last year, but you have to start from like basically June 1st onward. His April and May were so bad they tanked his numbers. But he was so good from June onward.
Melendez starts every season at the plate. It just makes all the season numbers look terrible.
Right. Well, and Melendez unfortunately wasn't able to. Like, Melendez started terrible, had a hot stretch, and then finished terrible. So he was high in the middle. He was Ohio. He was high in the middle and round on both ends. Renfroe, at least, I think, sustained it a little bit after June. I think he had an injury issue. But, I mean, what do you guys make of the moving guys like Massey and Garcia to the outfield? I mean, again, like, I do get that they got a bit of a log jam, right? Because like India's mostly only played second. He doesn't have a great arm, so it's hard to figure out where he should play. He did. He lost a ball in the sun. Now again, it's Arizona. We know how weird Cactus League is. But in India's first game in left field, he lost a ball in the sun and turned it into a double. Massey actually made a really nice running catch on the track a few days ago. I don't really recall a specific thing that happened today when I watched it with the outfield playing. MJ Melendez homered today, by the way, so that's something to see. But what does this sound like? What vibes do you guys get from hearing that? I know you haven't watched it much, but do you get the vibes that like, hey, we're just trying to have a lot of versatility, or does this seem like this roster doesn't really fit? We don't know who plays where. Maybe we'll get back to you on that. What vibes do you get from all this shifting around?
Oh, you got thoughts?
Go ahead there, Quentin.
Oh, I was going to let you take it, but I was just going to say, You
do have to talk on a podcast, boys. Both of you eventually have to talk.
Too Midwest polite here on this podcast.
Yeah.
Here yell.
Let's go.
Eventually we'll get more assertiveness.
Yeah, eventually we'll get to the take level where we're just screaming at each other. But episode 1, not at each other or anything, getting a feel for it all.
I can't do everything here, guys.
Episode 1, we're gonna look back and laugh.
That'd be nice.
I think, a lot of it is out of necessity because there's simply too many guys on the infield. There's not enough positions for them to play. And like I said, we don't have any really proven guys in the outfield. So I think it makes sense to see what they could do out there in spring. I think Garcia in center is intriguing. Obviously, he's got athleticism and spades, and
I agree with you. That's probably the one I like the most out of all that because his bat, frankly, is not good enough for third at this point. Like it hurts me to say it because I mean, you remember Key, like how many times in our text chain with you and me and Kyle have I called him Diet Bobby because of how hard he can hit the ball and what his advanced metrics say about his exit velos and stuff. But like the production ain't there, man. You're not a third baseman when you're that kind of hitter.
No, so, he doesn't really make sense. He doesn't really make sense at third.
He's a good defender, but the bat's just not good enough. Like
so and Isbell was serviceable in center, but ultimately you can upgrade there. So we can see what Garcia can do in center. Plug somebody else in at third. Of course, we got a lot of options. Second, third. See what Massey can play in left. It's better to have too many infielders than too many outfielders because you could put out infielders in the outfield. You can't really go the other way around. So
Usually
Blake,
not, yeah.
might as
you're
well
the
see what they can do out there.
you're the analytics guy of the bunch, so I'm sure you're familiar with all the recent trends that Kaufman's definitely become a hitter's park with the size of the outfield. And
Yeah.
noticing this being a weak spot for the Royals defense are these outfielders. So I think it's just one of those throw things at the fans, see what sticks, see what works. Like I said, it's something for the kind of, I guess you would call it, the new front office. JJ Cole has been here for a while, but something to think about as you kind of build teams for the future is what your home park looks like. Which we'll get into later. How long is Kauffman Stadium, Kansas City's home park? But yeah, that's what
That's a good question. Yeah, what are do they try to model the new park after the dimensions of Kauffman, you think, or are we going to see something different? I don't know. That's a good question. Did you have a thought there?
Oh, I was gonna say just so early to tell on that one. They gotta get something submitted before that. But yeah, that's the.
If they really wanted to impress us, they would build their park around the team they have right now.
Well, that might be a little short term. That might be a little.
You do see teams doing that though, where they'll drastically move, an infield wall in or out, in certain seasons. I don't know what that process looks like in terms of getting it approved by the league, but I feel like that is something we've seen in recent years where teams
just look at Bobby Witt's spray chart and see what works the best for him.
Right. Well, I mean, the Orioles did that. We talked about that going into the Orioles series last year when they played them in the playoffs and how, it actually kind of played into the Royals' favor because a lot of the Orioles lineup, as good as it was structured around a ton of left-handed power. And guys like Cole Reagans and the Royals had three good lefties coming out of the bullpen in Long, Zerpa, and Bubic last series, and they essentially shut the Orioles lineup down. So, that's the what's the phrase? The Jekyll and the Hyde, I guess, of building your ballpark to fit your team is then you start building your team to fit your ballpark. And sure, it makes sense for a 162 game season. But if you've got a lineup that's stacked with a bunch of lefties and only maybe one good right-handed hitter, and you face a team that's got an ace lefty and two or three good lefty relievers, that's how you score one run in 2 games and not get knocked out in the first round. So I don't know. I don't love, frankly, the idea of trying to. I mean, I guess if you have the ability to adjust your ballpark every single year to fit some weird need of your team, I guess it's something to do, but I assume it's not that simple. So I wouldn't go overboard with that approach, but it's certainly an interesting idea. Yeah. And I do wonder how similar the new ballpark would be to Kauffman. So, but we still got a few more years until we got to deal with that situation. So back to this year's team, I do kind of agree with you though, that it's like the outfield, it's like whatever the opposite of if it ain't broke, don't fix it is. That's what the Royals have in their outfield situation. It's like it can't be a ton worse than it's been the last year or two.
Nobody's going to fault anyone in that front office or manager Q for trying something different. You know what I mean? If there's a failed experiment a month or two in, I don't think I think he'll be shielded from criticism for at least trying something different. But
all right.
And I honestly think we have some intriguing options in outfield still. I mean, there's Joey Weimer we picked up in the India trade. Nelson Velasquez is still AAA. I mean, when he's been up, he's got a lot of pop. Drew Waters. So, I mean, there's guys that we can bring up and if other guys struggle, just to see what they got. But for right now, yeah, just move guys around. That's what you do in out of the park.
Yeah.
Baseball simulator.
My favorite simulator.
Try them on different positions, make the numbers go up, and see what they can do.
I believe we've already come close. It might not be super reflected in the meeting, but I think our recording is probably getting close to an hour already. We've really been talking. I do kind of want to, before we sign off for this first episode, I do kind of want to like delve a little bit into, you know, Kyle, we might lose you a little bit, I guess, here, but Q, I'm kind of curious, like if we go off of like minor league options and stuff like that, like who we do and don't expect or want to make the roster. Like there's those guys on the bubble. You threw out those guys like Weimer and Waters. So like what's interesting about guys like Waters, and then there's a couple guys, Velasquez too. Sorry, I forgot about him. Waters and Velasquez in the outfield, and then you've got a couple guys like Carlos Hernandez on the pitching side, and like Nick Prado. I think we all know who the general core lineup's going to be. Like we can probably nail down something like 21, 22 or so of the 26-man roster already. But, it's going to be those guys on the fringes. And, minor league options are kind of like, well, from the team perspective, they're the saving grace of inventory. And then from the player's perspective, they're the dreaded thing that means like I have to basically I have to have a perfect spring and then almost Machiavellian hope that a guy ahead of me doesn't or twist his ankle or something to make the roster. Because, guys that have options are safe in their inventory, whereas guys that don't, if you want to send them down, you had to put them through waivers first. So like, let's just take a few of the guys that I know are out of options. Q, you might even do a little looking on, see if you can find a more comprehensive list. But like we'll start in the outfield there. You threw out Waters and Velasquez. What do we want the starting outfield in general or in the outfield situation to look like? I mean, first of all, and I believe he actually does have one option left because he hasn't gone back down to the minors a ton. But I mean, now he's making $2.5 million because he's a first-year arbitration player. But like, look, I'm excited to hear about that he's changed his swing because we could all see that MJ Melendez had for as much power as he had. Either he's selling out for power or he just had a weird mechanics that he'd had his whole life, and we knew something needed to change. It does. They talked about it this offseason. By all reports, he does seem to have a different swing this year. He hadn't had much success when he played yet until today. He hit a homer. I mean, look, I'm excited that he's got a new swing. But assuming, again, if you could verify that, Q, that'd be awesome. But I believe he does have an option left. I know it's, teams are a lot of times really – they hate to send guys down who are making above league minimum, and he's in his first year of arbitration. But especially if somebody like Velasquez has a really strong spring for the next month or something, somebody who's out of options, like, hasn't Melendez had more than enough time? Like, I mean, look, if he tears the cover off the ball this spring, I get it. But why couldn't Melendez go down to make room for somebody who's out of like, eventually, like, where's the tough love for MJ Melendez? I don't even dislike the guy. A lot of Royals fans have just gotten sick of him and they just want him out of town. I don't feel that way about him because I see too much power potential, and I think he's actually adapted reasonably well to the outfield from being a catcher. I don't want him gone, but like, where is the kick in the ass? Where's the tough love for MJ Melendez? Why are we just assuming that he's on the roster? You know what I mean? So like, how do we feel about the outfield, and how do you feel about that specifically?
Well, if this Kings of Kaufman article is to be trusted, it looks like Melendez does have an option while Nelson Velasquez actually doesn't.
Yeah, I know Velasquez doesn't, and I think Waters is out of options as well.
I don't see him on the list. So
okay,
this list has Prado, Long, Bolin, Velasquez, and Carlos Hernandez. So only two hitters actually are out of options on the 40-man.
So those guys are all listed as out of options.
Correct.
Okay, so then so we assume that everybody else like, I think Bobby Witt has options, but we're not going there.
Right.
So
right.
Okay, so if we go on the assumption there that everybody else on the roster has I mean, now look, I don't know what the deal is with Drew Waters. I think the Royals have just decided they don't think he's part of the future. Like, they've had so many opportunities to play him more, and they just haven't. And it's not like his stats in the minors have truly blown anybody away. So I'm not even saying it's a bad thing. I assume unless there's multiple injuries in the outfield, I assume he'll get DFA'd and outrighted to Omaha, assuming he doesn't get claimed. I think Waters would need a lot of stuff to happen ahead of him to have much chance of making the roster. But I agree with you. Like, Velasquez wasn't that good last year. Like you said, he flashed some power. His overall stats, you could pull those up, Q. Maybe even his minor league stats too, because I want to say like he didn't exactly impress when he went back down to Omaha for the second half of the season either. But look, yeah, like we know Melendez has power, though I wonder how simplifying and shortening his swing does he then become, does that make him a better hitter overall, or does he then just become a 240 hitter instead of a 220 hitter but with less power? And then but Velasquez, I mean, we've seen enough to see that Velasquez is, has big time. Like we're talking like if you're on the 20 to 80 scouting scale, as scouts do, and as we know from the OOTP days of playing out of the park baseball. I mean, wouldn't you agree? Velasquez probably has like what, 65, 70 power, home run power at least. So I mean, yeah, where is that tough love for MJ Melendez, dude? Like look again. If Melendez has an awesome spring, great, love it. But if Velasquez outperforms Melendez handily this spring, and then Melendez just makes the roster as a shoe-in and Velasquez has to get DFA'd and go through waivers, like I will start to, again, not the screw MJ Melendez, get the guy out of town bandwagon, but like I've even held off on criticizing the Royals for how they've handled him because I do think patience is something that a lot of pro sports teams don't have. But like, wouldn't you agree? Like, why couldn't Melendez go down to make room for Velasquez if that's what the performances tell you to do? That would bother me.
I think the long-term answer to that, Blake, too, is in terms of for previous seasons, like you said, there's been the element of patience. And then I think in general, there's been such a lack of depth in the minor league system in previous years that you kind of wonder, who is he really blocking that's just this surefire thing. So, again, I'm not saying that's an excuse to keep getting them at bats and giving them a shot after shot. But it's not like we're necessarily, blocking anybody else from getting huge opportunities that are a lock. I mean, that's a different conversation this year if he starts out slow again. But that's, in my opinion, probably why they've been shielded from too much criticism on that.
That's a good point. And I think from a practical standpoint, it makes sense to, if all else is equal, or even if one guy is a little bit better than the other, if one guy has an option and the other guy doesn't, you send the guy with an option down. You let the guy without options, give him a chance at least.
Right.
If it's a total disaster, you can swap him out then.
Right. And so I think we're on the same page there, Q. Like, now, again, I understand also, like, some people might hear this and react like, well, you don't want to go too much off of spring training stats, which I get. But, I mean, spring training is to an extent as well. It's also an audition. And, again, if Velasquez outperforms Melendez handily this spring, like if it's, because they're both like average to slightly below average corner outfielders. So defensively, Melendez might even have the edge. But like, especially offensively, if Velasquez outperforms Melendez, and then Melendez, who has an option but is already in arbitration, if he just makes the roster because of that, and Velasquez has to get DFA'd just for the status quo, it sounds like you're on the same page with me. That I haven't even really joined the bitching about MJ Melendez bandwagon yet. Not really from his perspective yet, because I figured eventually he would have to change his swing. It appears that he has, and not even from the Royals' perspective, because that's the main reason. What Kyle said is that I didn't see a ton of better solutions. But if the signs are there that Velasquez
for Gavin Cross to start ripping the cover off the ball this year.
He did have a bit better year last year, but he's still got some work to do to reestablish himself as a prospect for sure. But that, I mean, it sounds like you agree with me though, Q. Like that would bother you if Velasquez outperforms Melendez this spring, and then they just keep Melendez up because of the status quo, and he's making more money, and they make Velasquez go through waivers. Then they officially have gone too far with the patience of MJ Melendez.
Yeah, if they did that. That would feel like a Dayton Moore move.
Yes.
Not a JJ Baccola move.
Right.
JJ, I think, makes the smart, not only baseball decision, but roster, just realistic decision of how do you keep both guys.
That's such a great point too, because they drafted Melendez and they didn't draft Velasquez. They traded for him a year or two ago.
Mm-hmm.
And that does seem like something Dayton Moore would have done. It was like, well, but MJ's our guy, and we invested a draft pick in him, and we nurtured him like a child. We fed him and bathed him and brought him up through a minor league system. And how could we possibly send him to the minors. Plus, he's making so much money now. We don't like to have minor leaguers making millions of dollars.
Blake, I thought you said we weren't going to get political on this podcast. Dayton Moore is exploring running for governor for state of Kansas here in this upcoming election. So here you are, podcast one, already diving into politics now. He's officially intertwined with local politics.
Oh boy! So now every time we bring up Dayton Moore in a Royals. So every time we bring up Dayton Moore in a Royals podcast from now on, it's political because of his.
Yeah, just like Frank White now too. He's Frank White, the politician. As a lot of people.
Hey, you know what? Well, those are the third rate. Those might be the political third rails we could touch though, because it's local politics and it's guys who have sports relevance. So
that's right. Yeah,
true.
So let's see. Final couple things on the roster as we wrap up here. Well, okay, Q. So, in fact, I think I might have seen. It was a few days ago now. I think I might have been going off of that same Kings of Kaufman article you found. So yeah, if we assume that those are the only guys on the roster who are out of options, and then obviously there's situations too where like maybe a guy never exhausted his minor league options, but I think once he's into his arbitration years, he has the right to like decline a demotion. Essentially, there's things like that.
Yeah, too. There's the guys where technically they have options, but they're not going to be used.
Right. Like Bobby Witt or guys again who have enough service time to refuse.
Like I don't know if Vinny still has one, but we're not
mentioning Vinny. It's irrelevant, right? So, honestly, the only other, I think we know Nick Prado's not making the roster. I haven't seen anything from him to say that like he's anything more than a quadruple A player. Sad to say, but Carlos Hernandez though, that's an interesting one. Where are we at on him? Like, because I still think as good as Lucas Erceg was last year, I'm not saying to put anybody above anybody, but Hernandez might still have the most raw talent of any pitcher on this roster, certainly reliever. Guy that throws consistently triple digits, very good curveball, but just wildly inconsistent. So I guess the question, the debate we're pondering here is, what about guys like Chris Stratton, who had a pretty bad year last year, had a player option, kind of like Hunter Renfroe. I think it's less money, but it's even less of a guy you wanted back. Renfroe, I don't think, you probably would have rather not have him controlling the option, but they might have brought him back on a similar 1-year deal anyhow. You see what I'm saying? Whereas like Stratton, I think the Royals would have been happy to move on from if he didn't have his player option. So, are we willing to send Carlos Hernandez through waivers and outright him to Omaha, or let's assume that nobody blows anybody away in spring training, that the decisions aren't any more obvious for injury or any other reason a month from now. Have you seen enough from Carlos Hernandez to cut Chris Stratton and his $4.5 million salary, or potentially send a different reliever? Like, let's say, I think he came into spring training and then got hurt. But like, let's say James MacArthur comes back and has a few good games in spring. Do you option MacArthur or somebody like that down to keep Hernandez on the roster? How do you guys, I'm curious how y'all feel specifically about Carlos Hernandez.
I think it's good to be in the position we are now, where we're debating whether he belongs on the roster, whereas a couple of years ago, he was far and away the best reliever on the team.
Yeah.
I think, like you said, he's got the stuff. Does he have the movement? I don't know. He gives up a lot of long balls.
Yeah.
But so does a lot of this bullpen, frankly. I think the bullpen should be improved. Just if through depth, than nothing else. And like I said, I don't know who else has options that we could send down. I don't know if Lynch has options, or
I would assume they would have listed him in that list if he did not have options.
If he didn't, yeah. So I'd rather send down like guys who were at least at one point looked at as starters. Send them down and just put them
Lynch flashed
in
some out of the bullpen last year.
That's true. Yeah, no, I think he he could be a weapon and too. And a lot of this is obviously dependent on spring training. We're going to see how they perform, and that's going to play a big role in it, and health as well. Is Kyle Wright able to come back early in the season, or is he going to take a little bit longer? But this is a vet heavy bullpen, so there's going to be some decisions to be made for sure. Maybe you can trade one or two of these guys for a bat or a minor leaguer. I don't know. What do you think, Kyle?
Yeah, I think bullpens obviously are that one part of the roster that can drastically change from year to year, and you just hope for the Royals case that it can't be much worse. You also see it as an option too, wondering what starting pitching looks like coming into this year without Brady Singer, kind of the league average pitcher. Would you guys agree? Kind of the definition of, high
He
floor.
has his stuff is better than league average, but his lack of variety of his arsenal makes him league average.
Yeah, so maybe that's we saw a little bit of experimenting with, openers and that kind of thing last year. If we kind of struggled to put together a full consistent rotation, maybe you hope that this bullpen in the aggregate can kind of make up for that lack of depth and consistency out of the starting rotation. But yeah, I think bullpens for me year to year, just one of those. Every year there's guys that, especially around the trade time, you just have guys popping up left and right that you had no idea would be worth anything or any good. It's just, teams are a lot smarter about using them, and like you said, you see a lot of converted starters moving to bullpen if they've got the stuff but don't have the control past a couple innings. It's always one of those things that's hard to read into at this time of year, I think.
All I know is that Kyle is probably rooting against one particular guy because, there can only be one Kyle Call Me Mr. Right in town. Isn't that right? Like, that guy can't find too much success. He can't have him sticking around.
I'm always support a team Kyle, man. Can't have enough Kyles out there.
But he's Kyle Call Me Mr. Right. Wasn't that supposed to be your?
I don't know. I don't think I'm that stubborn, but.
Oh man. All right. We had a few other things, random silly topics we could have got into. I'm assuming we'll probably be doing this weekly. We could even do it a couple times a week for shorter episodes. So maybe we'll save some of the goofy topics for later because we've rambled quite enough, I think, for episode 1. And it's going to be a collaborative effort to get this thing off the ground. And we'll all be taking our stabs at, editing and production and stuff. So bear with us as we get through this. But I think we'll leave it here for now. But you'll be hearing from us again very soon. Kyle, Q, I assume we'll stick around a little bit after this, but appreciate you guys joining, and we'll look forward to the next one.
Been a blast.
Until next time.
Sounds good.